start with, we will play this short video and hope everyone can hear it.
China is a country with an authentic history that dates back to about 23 centuries before the birth of Christ, and it has often been referred to as the sleeping giant of Asia. But in modern times, it has been awakened with a political upheaval that has shattered her foundations to the breaking point.
When we look at the 60th anniversary of the icebreaker mission, we remember that it took them 7 days to get to Hong Kong, 3 days to get from Hong Kong to Beijing, that poverty and disease was everywhere, the Chinese borders were unsafe, and the people had suffered terribly from the Japanese War and from civil war. It was a country which we would find it hard to imagine today existed. And these 18 people went to that country and signed trade agreements. And you have to ask yourself the question, why did they do it? What did they see? The British have a reputation for being sound, for being honest, for being reliable, and for knowing what they're doing, for being professional. If the Chinese were looking for the people in the Western world who were going to help them reopen their trade lines, nobody better than the British. They felt that they were listening to people who really were going to take China back. And most people discounted what they said. They said, you're living in a fool's paradise. China can never get out of where it is. China is stuck in the 19th, 18th, 17th century. But they were right. But they were right. And why were they right? It's because they drew on the historical understanding of China that was vitally important. And secondly, what was vitally important was they listened to what was being said to them and analysed it in their own terms.
I remember when PRC was just founded in its infancy. And there was a very difficult time because of the geopolitical situation in those days. And this icebreaker had the guts and the vision to pave the way for the bilateral trade relations between UK and China. So it's a wonderful institution, and we appreciate very much what it has been doing all these years.
I think the 48 Group's got a very good relationship, obviously, with China, but part of it is to do with the style of the work. As I've said, it's candid, it's trustworthy, it's honest, and it's positive. All of those are very important things. One of the things I was responsible for at the Foreign Office was what we called public diplomacy. What you don't want to do is to patronise people or misunderstand their objectives or misunderstand the way in which they think. So it's worth putting in a great deal of work around very practical things. The 48 Group has, of course, got a very practical history, so they add knowledge not just to the content but to the style.
The 48 Group, of course, which is British, but it's got 60 years of history, and with it, very importantly, an enormous amount of respect from the highest levels of Chinese thinking and policy. I've been at events with the 48 Group where top Chinese policymakers have been honoured to have been invited to events by the 48 Group, and there's not many people in the UK that are in that position, so I think it's quite special in that regard.
Sometimes I compare China to a comet. You know, a comet has a tail. If you don't understand the tail, you'll never understand the comet. And we understand the tail. We understand where these policies come from over 30, 40, 50, 60 years. When the Chinese talk to us, our understanding of where this comes from isn't just to look at it as of today, but to understand where it's come from and where it's going to.
So many British policymakers find it really tempting to just assume that our democracy is so fantastic that that's what everybody else in the world wants. And with it, we find it quite easy to lecture other parts of the world, China included, about how they should live their lives. If we want to do a lot of business with them, you just can't do that.
When we say icebreaker, we certainly refer to the past when we need somebody, some institution, to break the ice, to initiate a kind of relationship, bilateral relationship or multilateral relationship. But we should understand that the job will never be done because there are new ice congealed under some very tough conditions, and we will continue to break ice.
And really what's unfolding now in people's minds is this recognition that something incredible has happened in China in 30 years. They've transformed their country. They've moved 500-600 million people off the countryside into cities. They've built the high-speed train faster than anybody in the world. They've got roads covering China that were never there. They are involved in the creation of a civilization that is absolutely unexpected. The Chinese are extremely good at research, experimentation, drawing conclusions and objectivity. And I think we have an unusual understanding of that process.
I think the 48 group can play a huge role in influencing people's experiences and thinking of how to behave in terms of cultural exchanges, because 48 group, having had 60 years of experience on the ground with senior people in China and taking people back and forth, obviously understands the complexities, I think, rather well, probably better than most, if not all, that I've come across. And I think they can play a unique and very helpful role in trying to help educate people in order to help themselves to do more business. And I think the 48 group has got a huge role to play in that regard.
Thank you to CSSA for inviting me. I was at the first founding meeting of CSSA several years ago in Cambridge. And I remember sitting there looking around the room wondering what this organisation was for and what it was about. Little did I realise how many thousands of Chinese students, undergraduates, postgraduates, doctorate students, teachers, would come to the UK and participate in CSSA. I have a very special place in my heart for CSSA because of the work that it does amongst the Chinese student and postgraduate population. And it's always a pleasure to come to Oxford. I studied in London, which of course I think at UCL, which of course I think is superior to Oxford. And I enjoy coming to Oxford to remind myself that UCL is indeed superior. It's the way we have of talking. Do you do it in China as well? If you come from one university, do you talk badly about other universities? Is that a Chinese way? Or is that just a British way? Same thing. Actually, when I went to UCL, it had a good reputation, but it wasn't very good. Today it has a good reputation, and I think it is quite good. But Oxford has always had a good reputation and is very good. But actually, I'm going to read you a speech in a minute when I get round to it. We've got hours, haven't we, to fill, so I can take my time. University College London was founded by a philosopher called Jeremy Bentham. And the reason he founded it in about 1834, something like that, was because places like Oxford and Cambridge, you had to accept the principles of the Church of England, the 48 Articles of the Church of England, otherwise you couldn't go to university. And UCL was the first university to allow people from other religions, or no religion, to go to university. Seems strange, doesn't it? It's only 150 years ago. So when people talk about human rights in China, remember we had our problems with human rights along the way as well in our country. And I guess it's not a phrase that Jeremy Bentham used, but it's one that I've used in other contexts, the phrase excellence through diversity. And that's what he was creating. I think he had a moral basis for his philosophy, his approach, but I think he was creating excellence through diversity. And the one great feature of British universities today, compared to when I was at university, is the diversity, the numbers of students from all over the world, and the benefit. It's not easy to identify, but the benefit of all this interaction between different peoples from different countries and different cultures, learning about each other and learning from each other, produces an excellence which probably wasn't in our universities 30, 40 years ago. Anyway, you asked me to talk about UK and China, and I actually thought I would start, if you don't mind, by talking about China. It's a subject I'm probably better on, but I think it's well. Let me tell you. You saw a little bit here about the 48 Group and its origins back in 1951, really, when some very famous Cambridge professors, Joseph Needham, Joan Robinson, and Geoffrey Kahn, I think was his name. The latter two, Robinson and Kahn, were two of the main writers of Keynes's economic philosophies. And Joseph Needham was the brilliant academic who wrote many volumes about the history of the science and civilization of China. And they invited my father to dinner in Cambridge. And at that dinner there was a Chinese person who spoke perfect English with an American accent. And they had a lot of discussion about Wall Street and all sorts of normal things that people talk about around a dinner table. My father had no idea that he was from China. And a while later he called my father from Berlin, I think, and said, "Would you come and meet me?" My father said, "Well, who are you?" He said, "Actually, I'm from China." My father, well, in those days, people didn't travel very much, and it was very exciting to be invited to go to Berlin. So he was a textile manufacturer, and he got on a plane and went to Berlin. And Chi Chao-jing was his name. His younger brother, is Chi Chao-ju, who was the ambassador here, was Mao's interpreter at one stage. Had a nickname of the megaphone, because he speaks so loudly. Do well here today, wouldn't he? Anyway, Chi Chao-jing told him that Zhou Enlai had asked him to go out and develop trade outside China, reopen the trade routes to the West, and to find someone to do it, and that he had contacted friends around the world, around Europe and around Britain, and they had identified my father as the person that they thought had the strength of character to resist the pressure that would be imposed upon him to not reopen the trade links. In those days, a lot of people were calling for boycotts of trade. The Korean War was going on. A lot of people were trying to stop the reopening of trade with China. And so he asked my father to do it. My father then led a delegation, he was Secretary General of a delegation to a conference in Moscow. Interesting, when you read the speeches at the Moscow Economic Conference, they were all about how to create international trade at a time of growing protectionism and containment of Russia and China. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That was 1952, April 52, and in July 52 my father started the business London Export Corporation Limited, buying and selling with China, and the next year, 53, he took 18 business people to China for the Icebreaker mission, and in 1954 the 48 Group was formally founded. Why is it called the 48 Group? I've got no idea. The story is that there were 48 companies represented at the founding meeting. It's possibly true. Strange name, isn't it? I wish they'd had a name like Sino-British Trade Organisation. I wouldn't have to explain it. That's how it started, and that's how they built their reputation from that China was a country which had a great history, and that it would return to being a great country. Again, is it all right? Try to turn the lights on. Just look at my face, the light, just come on. But if you'll excuse me, as you're all probably very used to academics who probably don't read speeches, I decided I wanted to take this rather seriously at 4 o'clock in the morning yesterday and write what I wanted to say, so that I didn't leave it to chance of what I would and would not remember if I spoke without a script. So if you'll excuse me, I will say, as I read this here, that talking about China is impossible. It's like trying to talk about a dictionary. It has so many sections and aspects, so many different parts. You never feel like you've managed to convey all there is to address. In my 40 years of working with China, I've amassed a lot of experience, some good and some bad. I've learned one thing. While the immediate is important, it is the underlying trends that are key, and working out what are the rocks hidden from view and how their emergence might affect the trends and how they might upset plans. Working with China has been a journey of great distance and scope. I started by opening the sale from the USA to China of the first goods sold to China immediately after Nixon reopened US-China relations in 1972. I'll just break here to tell you an amusing story. Well, amusing to me anyway. My father took me in July 1971. In May 1971, he had received a call from the American embassy, and they said, "Mr. Perry, your visa is here." And my father said, I didn't ask for a visa. In fact, you've never given me a visa, you've banned me for 15 years. And the consul said, "Do you want your visa or not?" He said, "Yeah." And he went and got his visa, and the next morning he was on a plane to America, having been banned for 15 years. And he rang the embassy. Of course, it was one of the first signals of the rapprochement between China and America that he was being allowed to visit America. So a couple of months later, we were invited to go to the Chinese commercial office, which then was in Blackheath. The Chinese commercial counsellor was a slightly, I can't say elderly man because I'm probably his age, but anyway, he was not very tall and didn't speak any English. And my father spoke no Chinese, nor do I. And he had a wonderful interpreter who I still know today. We're sitting there discussing tea and the weather and stuff like that. And then he took my father by the hand and he took him to the fireplace. And he ducked down into a big fireplace up here, and he ducked down into the fireplace, and all I could see was him talking to my father in his ear. I thought, this is very strange. And then they came out from under the fireplace. And then the interpreter went under the fireplace with my father and talked in the other ear. And then after a while they came out and sat down and talked about a lot of things. They gave my father a piece of paper, and we had finished our cup of tea and we left. And I said to my father in the car, "What was that all about?" He said, "It's the strangest thing. I've never known anything like that before. I guess they took me into the fireplace because they were sure that nobody could overhear the conversation." I said, "Yeah, but what did they say?" They said, "We want you to go to America and prepare for us to buy 3 commodities. We'll give you the list when we sit down. And we want you because you know how to open business for us." And I said, "What was that?" And he said, "It was cotton, polyester, and agricultural chemical." And I said, "So what are we going to do?" He said, "You're going to America." And that was the start of my work. And it really started from a fireplace, my work. Anyway, we sold many millions of dollars of goods, and it was a very strange and testing experience. I continued to trade commodities in Europe and the USA to and from China. This was our company's traditional business. I built a dinnerware business in the USA after helping China develop the capability to meet the fashion, style, and legal requirements of the American market. I did the same in the UK. The work in trading with China and building consumer goods markets in the West taught me a lot about how Chinese think and work. The business I covered was in today's values worth many billions of dollars. But emerging from the business experience, I developed, as I said, a great deal of knowledge of Chinese thinking and used that to project where China wanted to go. So I did not get surprised by policy changes. This had happened often to me, and I learned that there was no advance warning, but it was clear in hindsight what had been planned and why. So I studied a lot about what might happen. I focused more and more on projecting Chinese policies, and that enabled me to develop a business as a deal maker, a consultant, an expert on corporate strategies on China. So today I want to talk to you about my experiences, my views on China, and my views on the future opportunities that it presents and the risks that are out there. The title of today's talk is about the future potential of UK-China trade and investment, and I place that in the context of understanding China. 70% or more of China-UK trade is decided by China, in my experience. They decide what they will buy and from whom, and they decide what they will export and where to. The British role is not irrelevant, and hard work by the British pays off, but the main feature in the trade and investment is from China. So we need to start our journey there. Understanding China's journey will illuminate the trade and investment path. I hope my analysis is interesting and is a good one.
It's just my opinion from reading and feeling China for 40 years in my work, and from another 20 years of listening to my father's experiences. China was saved from destitution by the 1949 victory of the Communist Party. It settled the huge contradictions and pain of the period from 1840, when foreigners invaded China, through the pain of the overthrow of the imperial dynasties, then the Civil War and the anti-Japanese war. China needed a winner and a commitment to rebuild the nation, and that is what 1949 brought. Whether you support the Communist Party or not, there is no doubt that 1949 was the beginning of the end of old China and the end of disease and disorder, subject to the Cultural Revolution, which I'll talk about later. From then to 1964, China was moving towards consolidation and trying to find a way forward for its socialism and its people. The Great Leap Forward failed for many reasons, but the biggest reason was the 3 disastrous years of harvests which brought widespread pain and suffering. Excuse me. This was followed by the split with the Soviet Union, which was painful and led to more economic challenges in the early 60s as the Russians pulled out their technicians and support. A new way focusing on economic development to bring the Chinese people out of poverty was developed by Chen Yun, Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping in 1964. Not 1978, but 1964. And that was called the 4 Modernizations. Mao disagreed with economics in command and resisted this economic agenda, believing that building socialism was the real purpose. To defeat the economic agenda, he brought on the Cultural Revolution, which was to make the socialism deep in the Chinese soul. A lot of good ideas did come about during that period. Some continue today, such as learning from and experiencing what the people experience. But the period became marked by extremism and almost religious fanaticism, with evil attacks on people for their perceived ideas and histories. Many people suffered during this period. Eventually, the Gang of Four, the leaders of this reactionary and violent period, were removed, and the return of Deng, aided by Chen Yun, emerged, as Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi had died. These 2 men then built a plan to rebuild China as an Asian economy, mainly self-reliant and based first upon using foreign capital and technology to build the economy based on low-cost exports. An entry into the WTO was the final part of that process, which built huge reserves and economic power for China. The world was surprised by the emergence of China as a great force in global trade, based primarily on exports to developed markets of cheap goods, where the main margins were earned by the foreigners. The RMB rate was moved from 5.8 to 8.3 in 1992, and those who were watching knew something special was about to happen. China's imports had been paid from oil exports, and now China was becoming an oil importer, and its exports of consumer goods would transform China's trade patterns and global trade. China could see the routes to markets were already there, mainly developed by ASEAN and Japan, South Korea and Taiwan. China just replaced them as the lowest cost manufacturer. China built its relations with its 14 neighbours and with the USA, Europe and Russia. They were all part of this huge avalanche of trade which developed. China became the largest holder of foreign currency reserves, and when the USA predictably became concerned about the rise of China around 2007, Hank Paulson tried to force China to follow the Japanese Plaza Accord and revalue the RMB. Madame Wu Yi faced him down and told him, "We have your treasury bonds. Don't threaten us." Confrontation, the significance of that was that China was ready for that moment from 10 years before. And that's what people don't understand. The advanced planning and thinking through of China is really very deep. Confrontation was avoided, though, by the Lehman financial crisis, and the USA moved away from focusing on China for a few years. However, China was already experimenting with its move towards a domestic-focused economy which would complete the move of 1.2 billion people from the land to the towns and cities, and moving, maybe a billion, moving its trade from the developed countries towards the developing countries. When Obama turned again after Afghanistan and Iraq pullouts to an Asian tilt, the Americans found a very different terrain to that which they had faced in 2007 in Asia. ASEAN had become a free trade area, and China was beginning to invest globally in resources and markets and brands, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was a fully established body. But the key was that while China's trade kept growing, it was the development of a market economy in China with a growing private sector that was the new form. So we come to the emergence of Xi Jinping as the new leader of China. He has seen off challenges by those who would bring back politics in command, those who would advocate an American economy with a small state and free private sector, and those who believe political reform must be addressed in advance or alongside economic construction. Xi is very clear that a market economy is the way to build socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is about growing the economy and providing social justice. It is to be achieved by allowing the market to determine the resources, but the party and state, in my opinion, will still guide the whole process and make sure it's not wasting resources and is developing the right future sectors of the economy. The party and state will have a strong influence through a strong state-owned sector, which is cleaned and professionalized as it has been going on for the last 10 years since Zhu Rongji took a knife to the state-owned enterprises. The economy will take another 6 years to change and take its shape as a socialist market economy, as the target for the major restructuring is 2021, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. The main instrument of influence will be strategic shareholders in state-owned enterprises and in the private sector. The private sector in China is unlike any other in the world. It was created by the party, and the party will contain it from excessive influence and challenges to the socialist agenda. This might sound dogmatic, sometimes it is, but in general, it's not a dogmatic position, it's a very creative process that's going on. The private sector of China is not going to be allowed to wreck the journey, as it has shown the capacity to do that with the recent financial crisis in the West. China's socialism will contain a great deal of capitalism, but will learn from Marx's analysis of capitalism. He understood the huge positive role of capitalism, but also that unrestrained and unregulated, it would lead to massive monopolies and abuse. So strong regulators will also be a key part of the mechanism that China uses to ensure the market economy stays within its targets. We have seen 4 of these in the last 10 years, and they have been the experiments which will serve to guide many future regulators. The next phase of China's reforms, to be ushered in by the annual meetings of the National People's Congress and the People's Consultative Commission in March, will address the structural reforms to establish the new base for the Chinese economy. In that context, I think we will see that the shadow banking is a problem, but also a vehicle for reducing provincial power from fundraising, selling land rights, and operating businesses. They will become deliverers of local services, and their roles will be replaced by 15 regions controlled from Beijing. So more local responsibility for caring, but more central control of the key levers of the nation state. The development of fairness and social justice will be the hallmark of China, and the Scandinavian economies and Germany have given China many ideas about how the state redistributes the benefits of its policies more fairly and widely. We have seen an era of French red wine and excess in the private sector. Now we will see an era of social justice as health and welfare is put in place. There is much more proximity between responsible capitalism and socialism with Chinese characteristics, in my opinion, than those with dogmatic and prejudiced views based on labels would want to recognise. Huge developments in the market and in the service industries, a big change in the financial services, and major new welfare initiatives based upon main business How did the president find me? Okay, let's get worked up again. Hang on a second. Huge developments in the market and in the service industries, a big change in financial services, and major new welfare initiatives based upon making business responsible for those it makes unemployed. Let me just stop there and tell you what I'm referring to there. You're probably familiar with the recent flotation of the Royal Mail here in the UK. And we've privatised a lot of companies in the UK. And what happens is, after they're privatised, they boost their profits enormously. How do they do it? By taking a knife to a quarter, third, or half of their workforce. It's not by expanding their businesses so much as cutting their costs. All of that cost is put onto the state in unemployment, and it's the taxpayers that pay it. China will not allow that to happen. So if companies streamline their operations, they'll have to find new jobs for their employees. It's a whole different way of thinking about the responsibility of business. And they will be responsible for the health and welfare of their staff, their families, and their retirees. The state will be the provider of last resort, and the richer will pay for their care themselves. A revolutionary welfare state based upon the experience of the West, but not copying the overweight and politically controlled welfare state that predominates in the West. Again, let me take a moment to give you another thought on this. You're probably, maybe, all aware that GSK got themselves into trouble in China because of corruption in paying off the doctors. I've got news for you. There's nothing new about that. It's been going on for 25 years. And everybody in China knew it was going on. It wasn't as if suddenly somebody found out that GSK were paying off the doctors now. And everybody thought the story was that China was taking serious steps about corruption. True, taking serious steps about corruption. And long overdue. But something else was going on that GSK didn't understand and still don't understand. Businesses may take care of the health of their staff, but how are you going to control the cost of that health? In the West, the pharmaceutical companies are the most profitable companies, most profitable business sector. China's government was saying, we are taking a knife to the profit margins of the pharmaceutical sector. We will not allow the people to pay the profits of big pharmaceutical companies, not only foreign ones, but Chinese ones. So the driving down of costs of the health sector is a policy of the government. The delivery of healthcare will be the job of business. It is a combination of functions and roles, very different from anything we see here. How different it is, I'll tell you how different it is from the way we do it here, is that I'll say this quietly, I'm sure we're not being recorded. Who did David Cameron take in to see the Chinese Premier? GSK. And the Chinese Premier would have looked at him and said, this is the man who's costing you a fortune on your health bills in Britain, and you want me to... Anyway, a big difference in approach. And it's a very interesting difference in approach which provides a lot of business opportunities for British business in China to learn, but also to benefit from. So a revolutionary welfare state based upon the experience of the West, but not copying the West. China will buy and protect the resources it needs from the international markets and build and protect its exports. All its trade will be enhanced by investment to buy the resources, brands and technologies that it needs, and will invest in the logistics to make it happen. It will globalise its core sectors such as nuclear and solar and car industries and be a major player globally. It will build a military so it cannot be pushed about and in the process experience some headwinds from those who feel fear of China's emerging size. China will seek to be friends with the USA, Russia and India, Europe and all its 14 neighbours, but will not acquiesce. The British had to make a decision after the First World War to fight the rise of the USA or accept it and benefit from it. Eventually they chose wisely, the latter. Today the British stand at the crossroads with China, to try and preach to China how they should develop or to participate in the new and major opportunities that exist with China. The UK can have a special economic relationship with China and become China's biggest trade and investment partner in China in areas such as nuclear plants, high-speed rail, financial services. The British can develop huge opportunities where first-move advantages are very real. The British will be tempted to ally themselves with American attempts to extract more concessions from China. But the Americans will change tack, as they have done 3 times in the last 30 years, without telling the British, and the British would be wrong-footed. So I hope it doesn't happen. If the British take a positive but not overly opportunistic approach, then Sino-British trade and investment will rocket. And all the signs are that that is the road the British are going down, and I'm very glad about it. If the British ally themselves with American tactics of disruption and containment of China excessively, then they will lose the Chinese interest in using London as a key centre for Chinese development, Chinese globalisation, and the globalisation of the renminbi. There has never been a time like today for the British to decide to be in or out of China. Last year, trade increased by 11%. Car exports boomed. Healthcare industry opened up for British investment, and a number of inward investment projects in the nuclear industry, real estate, and the prospect of investment in high-speed rail. The signs look good, and we should hope for the best. The opportunities in the free trade zones, one was announced, and within 4 weeks another 12 had been announced in China. These are areas which will provide special opportunities for the financial services sector, and the British are very positive about being involved in that area in China. On a note of caution, major UK-based multinationals must broaden their thinking about China at the top levels of their companies. This is also true of political leaders and civil servants. They need to recognise they do not know China, do not understand its history or its ways. Most importantly, they have relegated China to occasional review and do not get the future of the Chinese economy, the potential role for foreign business, and the impact of China's global agenda. China's global agenda provides huge opportunities for the British because the British are very experienced in global business and have many key positions in key parts of the world. China has a great interest in Africa, and most British companies have a lot of assets in Africa. There's great opportunities for combined work in those areas of the world. If British business, political and civil leaders engage in a period of understanding China, the benefits will be much, much greater. Our Chancellor has seen the opportunity for UK inward investment, and we must build on that to create new thinking on trade into and investment into China and global partnerships with China to leverage our position and value. On the other hand, Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela remind us that America is still the only major power in the world and can impact the world in huge ways. The fear of war is not without reality, but the Americans know that Vietnam cost them so much, so I doubt that China would be a candidate for conflict. We should see that the major transition of the Chinese economy towards domestic consumption and global markets provides huge opportunities for all, and especially the Chinese people, and for the British with our unique position and specialities. In closing my remarks, and it's a long closing, I'm afraid, in closing my remarks, I want to address the challenges of change that have allowed money to become the source of evil. As Mao knew, the change of direction of China would release ambition and greed. He wished to avoid that by constant replenishment of the spirit of the people and the party by forces which could not work, the forces of superstructure change. Politics in command was impossible as a long-term plan, as China has 1.3 billion people, and they must be fed, clothed, educated, and the vulnerable cared for. Agriculture could not be continued in communes and through peasant labour. China had to change to economic development because, under his policies, the population of China trebled to 3 times the size that China can sustain. He did that because he felt that was the way to increase agricultural production and because he felt that China needed a big army to resist foreign invasion, and Korea and Vietnam showed that need. Deng Deng, Zhou, Liu and Chen knew in 1964 that economic development was vital and that China needed to change or the people would suffer from extreme poverty. It was not till 1978 that they were able to change the agenda and focus on the plan to produce a medium-sized economy and to enable a per capita that would be reasonable. This is basically the number of $20,000 per capita by 2021 and a movement of 80% of the people from the land to urban life, enabling large-scale modern agriculture to dominate the land. But the corruption came with the black and white cat. I have not enjoyed what I have seen as the Chinese soul has been corrupted and fashion and self-interest and personal gain has replaced the caring soul of China. Some also point to the degradation of the environment as evidence of the negative and the unfair distribution of wealth in the nation. Some also point to the abuse of power by party members. These are all true, but the Industrial Revolution in the West was accompanied by the same phenomena. It is a natural byproduct of progress. I would have been very worried about the sort of nation China would have become, except for my belief that Xi Jinping gets the problem, and the Chinese dream is the new mantra for creating a moral and fair China. I hope I am right, and I hope he can make it happen. I think he can. For those in the West who want a Western-style government in China and advocate an independent private sector, I have this warning. I have seen the soul of naked Chinese ambition, and it doesn't look nice. It is like that which we've seen in many rising empires. We are fortunate that the Chinese state will, under Xi, control and contain the dangerous trends of self-interest and self-centered behavior. Managing China and its huge population is a huge undertaking, and the forms of management used by developed and educated nations coming from a religious history and culture are not suited to China's challenges. It's clear that China needs to create accountability and control of public officials, but our forms of control were the result of our histories and cultures. China's forms will be up to the Chinese people. One thing's for sure, Xi must ensure that China becomes fair and concerned for its environment, not at the expense of economic development, but as part of it. We in the West should not judge and try to change China. We develop by ourselves, and so must China. Regime change in China from outside would destabilize the whole world, and China should instead be engaged in a development of new regional and global architecture which enables development and makes conflict solved by words. In this last aspect, the building of greater independence is key, and bigger global trade and investments is the right way forward, so the UK and China can accelerate trade and investment because it is good for both nations, for the people of both nations, and for world peace. Thank you. Shall I go there, here? Sure. I'll take my friend with me.
I think for a great speech, I love the insights about how China is going to become more socialist almost. I mean, given the embracing capitalism, China can still become more socialist. I've got a question. How do you reckon that might be done? Because there's a dilemma about letting go of the private sector or increasing the public sector. At the same time, it seems like the public sector might not work as efficiently as most people would want it to be, which means it's almost necessary to let go of the control. What do you reckon?
I mean, first of all, I'm not an economist, I'm not a politician, I'm not a policy maker, so I'm a businessman by background. I kind of try to read quite a bit, and I try to get a sense of the answers to those questions, because you can have all the theories in the world, you can study all the people in the world you want to study, but you come back to those basic questions. And that question is, how do you manage the forces, the economic forces, and encourage development and growth, but prevent abuse? And I think it is by a great deal of study and anticipation of what is going to happen. So you take the example of shadow banking. I mean, I don't know how many people here are into shadow banking, have read about shadow banking. I don't know. So, okay, shadow banking is, you know, you've got the major banks in China, and then you've got another area about the same size where the private sector, all the people who made money, the SOEs, all the different people who've accumulated money, they buy products in other types of financial institutions which are then lent to people who need money. And the interest rate that they carry is much higher than the interest rate from the bank. But the people who are borrowing from that source of money can't get their money from the bank, so they get their money from this other type of what's called shadow banking. And people are very concerned that the shadow banking of China is about to collapse. Actually, the shadow banking of China is regulated. It's not regulated very tightly, and it's going to be regulated very tightly. But if you look at the numbers, the total volume of this, what we call private sector banking in China, is probably, together with the regular banking sector, the total of it all is about the right level of borrowing and lending for an economy the size of China. But you've got these two very different types of structures. One which is formal, which is the state, lending mainly to state-owned enterprises, and the second, which is mainly private sector, lending to the private sector. Well, I think that a great deal of anticipation went into what was going to be created here, and that the problems and solutions have been anticipated a long time in advance by the planners. But they've allowed the problem to mature and come into focus so that people agree with them about the solutions. So I think what you'll see in China is the problems of development will be allowed to happen, but the preparation for the solutions will already be there. I mean, they do get it wrong. Things get out of hand. I remember, you know, for example, in polyester as an alternative to cotton, they trebled the production. They all came on stream in 1 year. It was all going to come on stream in 1 year, and suddenly they cancelled contracts with Germany to slow down the building of new plants. The Germans went mad. This is the early 80s. And in the end, the rescheduling was done. So they do get things wrong. But in general, if you look at the chaos in the West from the financial crisis and compare it to the problems that occur in China from unexpected events, the problems in China are much smaller than the problems in the West. That's my view, anyway.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any question? Please go on.
Hi, Stephen. I just wanted to ask a question about the potential role Britain could play in terms of the free trade agreement between China and the EU. And you probably agree with me that China was quite disappointed with the EU in general, or Britain in particular, that refused to recognize China as a market economy. Yeah. And that was expressed by Fu Yi, former ambassador to the UK, recently in Davos meeting. She said that we don't bother now, you know, whether or not you recognize us or not, because we are already the biggest exporting nation in the world. Yeah. So, now, having said that, you cannot disguise that China is a disappointment, and to some extent the bitterness that the EU so far, you know, remains steadfast and refuse to get recognition. Now, China already signed a free trade agreement with Switzerland, which is a continental nation in Europe, although not part of the EU. And previously they have reached the same agreement with Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, but for one reason or another, you can see in terms of trade, they are not really significant, either in political region or a city-state. So what can Britain do now if, say, China still see that there's still no way to go, or see no chance to reach the free trade agreement with EU or Britain, and then they might pursue with Switzerland, use Switzerland as a foothold or bridgehead. Yeah. At the one stage, they even were talking about probably they would remove their RMBs offshore trading center to Zurich rather than in London. So, would Britain, having with all the positive factors that you just mentioned, would at least time Britain will see this chance again slip through its fingers? Yeah. Or still tied up with the US policies?
I mean, I think.
Towards China.
Thank you for asking that as a question. I think you're as expert as I am, more expert than I am, and within the question is a great deal of the answer. I think that the Chinese leadership, in my experience, is very practiced at pretending is the wrong word, but demonstrating a lot of unhappiness when it's really expecting the result that's coming from the other side of the table. The European Union has been a very inadequate body to deal with China, and every now and then you get people, particularly like the European Trade Commissioner, who decides to act like the Americans and try and be tough with China. And then the Chinese go to Germany and other countries, and before he knows it, he hasn't got the power to operate. So the Chinese power with Europe is a power to prevent rather than a power to create. And the resistance from Washington on the market economy, influencing various parts of the European Union, is significant. If the European Union was just 7 or 10 countries now, I think they would probably have agreed to market economy status. Because it's 27 or is it 30, I can't remember now, I think that it's very difficult to get a concerted opinion on an issue like the market economy. As you say, China is now the biggest exporter in the world, more significant than, not more, but as significant as that. If you look at China's trade statistics, we were talking about this before, up until 2007, well over 50% of China's exports were going to the developed nations. By 2 years ago, over 50% of China's exports were going to the developing world. China had anticipated, China used the West to build its export markets, and then it moved its exports focus away from the United States and Europe into the developing world. So, and with regard to free trade areas, the Chinese are aware that the Americans are trying to encircle China with an EU-NAFTA free trade area and TPPA. The combination of those, if they happen, will create a lot of difficulty for China. And so China started this. when the Doha round started to go wrong, China was the first to move and start creating bilateral free trade agreements. They did that because they knew that someone would, so they would be the first. They understood it better than most. And the creation of the free trade area with ASEAN blocking the development of APEC, which was the American choice, was a provocation to the United States. I think it was a sensible move. So when you now have this situation of a free trade agreement being developed between EU and NAFTA and with TPPA, including Japan, Chile, and all those sorts of people, well, of course, China will say to people like the EU, why don't you have a free trade agreement with us as well? And that is partly political and partly economic. It's probably easier for China and Europe to have a free trade agreement than it is for Europe and North America to have a free trade agreement. But the political drive for Europe and North America to coexist together in a free trade agreement is probably much stronger than between Europe and China. The jury's out. You know, we're either going into a world where you will have one area of trade and investment which is Western dominated, and then another which is Russia, China, SCO, BRICS, ASEAN, and so on and so forth. I think it's very difficult to predict the outcome, but there's certainly, you know, the early elements of a Cold War, of an Iron Curtain coming down again. I think that because China has anticipated these moves by having free trade agreements with Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, I think China is in a fairly strong position to deal with some of the worst aspects of any trade war that's really mounted on a major basis. The final point you ask is about the British. The British will say the British are saying the right things, and that's different. You know, in the past the British have been very circumspect about comments on this front, but David Cameron's been very direct. I would support a free trade agreement, and I'm sure he means it. David Cameron and George Osborne recognise we have real problems in this country about getting investment in infrastructure, investment inside our country. They turned to the pension funds shook their heads. They turned to the sovereign funds, and the sovereign funds shook their heads. The only people who have stepped up to the plate is China. And they realise that China presents a real opportunity for the British to solve some of the inherent contradictions in the British economy. So I think that the mouthing of the sorts of things that you're asking them to say will come easily. What China will then say is, well, what's the reality? Now, Britain can't have a free trade agreement with China on a bilateral basis because we're committed to work through Europe. I would imagine that the Germans would be happy to have a free trade agreement with China, and probably the French, although more limited in each of those cases, because their economies are more contained and more insulated from outside investment. But I think that it will be difficult when you just look at the problems in Ukraine, caused somewhat by conflicts between the American approach and the European approach. And for those of you who didn't read the comments of what the American State Department, the American State Department said to the American ambassador about the Europeans. If you haven't, I'm not going to repeat it because it's not appropriate language, but it will tell you a lot about the conflict between the Europeans and the Americans in Ukraine. So you've got some idea that Europe contains two lines, a European line, which Germany is the main representative of, and an American line, which the British were most representative of, but maybe they're not so representative of it now. We'll see. Not a very clear answer. I just raised, like you did, all the issues.
As I understand, the Beida and Qinhuang, they set up a research group to see whether or not there's any chance to break to into some of them they call soft target within the EU could do the bilateral. But obviously there's no chance. So I think they remain within the EU.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, but you see, when you get to the point where the British become so not dependent upon, but find Chinese investment so important, then the British may start to make some very fundamental decisions about their relationship with Europe. Because Europe is an export market. It's not a great source of investment into the United Kingdom. China is a great source of investment. And China didn't decide to invest in a British nuclear plant when George Osborne went to China. They decided that 10 years ago. They've been working on it for 10 years. The real estate investments, they've been planning for years. They've been researching and working out what to do for years. So deep in China, they have a very good understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the British and where the British might be prepared to accept different initiatives than some other countries. It's all out there to happen. Very interesting times.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Ladies first, yes.
Okay. So I want to thank you very much for your contribution and your families to the exchange of trade and also culture between China and Britain. But then my question is nothing to do with or business or some economic knowledge. It's just a culture thing. So it seems like you are expert of Chinese culture or China or Chinese people. So I just wonder, if you can just name one character to summarize, in your opinion, all the Chinese culture or Chinese people, what do you think is the most significant character?
Characteristic?
Yeah.
Or you're asking me to name a Chinese... what is the most significant characteristic of the Chinese people?
Yes.
I think their modesty. Modesty. Which is a weakness and a strength.
Yeah. Do you have any particular experience how you realize Chinese people are always modest?
People, from time to time, for example, I've been to an airport to meet a Chinese, somebody important from China, and they'll say he's in there, in that room there, around that table, and there will be 16 people around the table. I can't tell who the leader is. If it was a British group, I'd be able to understand it very quickly, because of there is a lot of pomp and ceremony that goes with China. We saw it here with Xi Jinping and the Standing Committee coming onto the rostrum to be greeted as the new leaders of China. But if you were, I think that there are pompous people in China who love to be noticed and seen. But I think, generally speaking, most Chinese that I have dealt with are fairly modest in how they present themselves and how they present their power and their personalities.
Why do you think it's also a weakness?
Because I think foreigners misunderstand it. I think a lot of foreigners think China is weaker and less clear about what it wants to do. So very often you go into a meeting, I would imagine it often happens that David Cameron will go into a meeting and people will ask him a lot of questions. And it will sound to him like they don't really understand very much and they're asking very basic questions. What he doesn't understand is they're being polite. And they're giving him face and they're giving him the opportunity to tell them things. It doesn't mean that they don't understand and they don't have their own view. But it's very easy. Most foreign business leaders develop a misunderstanding of China because they can't have a discussion on an equal basis with the Chinese. They can't have that kind of, not aggressive, but they can't have that kind of testing exchange that they would normally have with each other, because it's just not the way the Chinese talk and negotiate. Chinese are much more circumspect, much more careful about what they say and how they say it. So you are who you are. You know, we are who we are. People say the British are rather quiet. We're not very demonstrative like the French or Germans. Do we want to be different? We might want to be different, but that's who we are. So you are who you are. But you have to be aware of the consequence. People often misunderstand Chinese because of that fundamental difference in culture.
I think Chinese and British people are quite similar. British people are also very modest in how they talk about weather all the time.
Weather, yeah, sure. Do you agree with me about the character that I've identified?
Yeah,
characteristic.
This is definitely one of the most significant characteristics. But like, if this will generate more and more misunderstanding from the Western side, maybe we should change a bit more. But if we are powerful enough, then like more and more people like you will come to China and realize we are not just as weak as we appear.
I mean, I say to people, don't sit there and the Chinese will draw you out into answering questions. Don't do it. Ask questions. And ask and ask and ask until you get to the core. It'll be like taking the peel off an apple or an orange. It will take a bit of time, but when you get to the core of it. So if Mr. Osborne goes to China and asks about the welfare state, the Chinese will say, well, how do you do it? If he starts talking, he's in trouble because he's telling himself what he already knows. He's got to learn to get the Chinese to talk. And that's a bit of a skill, a bit of an art. It's not very difficult. I mean, I'm not particularly brilliant or anything like that at all. So if I can do it, other people could do it quite easily. But you have to understand that's what you have to do. And, you know, from your point of view, you know if you're going to be in business in the West, you've got to be a bit more like the Westerners. So you'll adjust yourself. But it won't be deep down. It'll be for the purpose of communication.
Thank you.
I've got a quick question to ask, actually. Sorry about that.
Is he allowed to?
Given your expertise, what do you think makes British consumer goods most competitive in confronting Chinese market?
What makes the British consumer goods?
What kind of British consumer goods would you consider as very competitive in the Chinese market?
Goodness me, couldn't you have told me that before I came? I could have gone to China. I mean, the biggest increase in exports, one of the biggest sectors that have increased is cars, Jaguar Land Rover. So I think that in the field of consumer goods, it's been mainly fashion-driven rather than price-driven. Yeah, I mean, I think that's price, but I think it is fashion-driven, isn't it, rather than price-driven. And I think that was also during a period. I'm a bit cynical here. I think when the West was in a bit of a recession, the Chinese encouraged their people to buy Western fashion goods in order to help demand and increase a positive attitude towards China. I think now there's a beginning to be a decline in Chinese purchasing of Western fashion goods, being replaced by more Chinese fashion goods, partly because the creativity of the Chinese is coming through in fashion. The prices are more interesting. And the availability is local. I think that process of change is a gradual one. It's not a fast one. So if you say, what are the goods that are sold in the British shops? Mostly they're foreign. So when you come down to what is British, Burberry, Rolls-Royce, cars, but a lot fashion, design, I think there's a great deal of creativity in London, and I think the Chinese like that, but I think it's more in the software than the hardware.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, go for it.
I would really like to ask one question, which is not very much related to business, but I mean, China is sort of expanding its economic influence, and as a result, it's trying to exert its influence in many other aspects. Then, can you sort of predict how well China is sort of adapting to the more international rules? And it seems it's trying to change it. Then, do you see that are there any changes that need to take place in terms of its foreign policies? I can give you an example. For example, the government used to hold faith in the non-interference policy in the domestic politics in foreign countries, but now it's trying to sort of safeguard its interests in certain countries. So do you think any change needs to be seen in the foreign politics, for foreign policies, I mean?
Was the first part of that about international institutions, or is it all about policy, foreign policy?
I mean, foreign policy.
Foreign policy. Yeah, I mean, it's been a big... I don't understand why. I've not seen a great deal of commentary in the Western media, but to my mind, Chinese foreign policy has changed substantially. Partly it's changed in response to the American change, and the Chinese had three alternative... I don't think the Chinese were surprised by Obama's change of approach to China. I don't think they were surprised by it. I think they'd anticipated it, and I think they decided to make the South China Sea the centre of the management of that rather than Central Asia. And I think they had three alternative ways of responding. One was to be aggressive, a second was to acquiesce, and a third was to be firm. And I think the Chinese decided that they would be firm. And so what you've seen is Chinese firmness in its foreign policy, and you've not seen it saying withdrawing towards its borders and allowing the Americans to encroach, or those who would say they're acting in some way in conjunction with the Americans, like the Japanese and the Philippines. The Chinese are holding a position with them of some firmness. So, Xi Jinping and State Councillor Yang, who's here now, both have made major statements on China's foreign policy, that our first priority is the 14 neighbours of China. The second priority is major power relationships, which is Russia, America, Europe, India, probably as well. They don't actually identify who the major powers are, but I think those would probably be who they are. You might include Germany and Britain in that. I don't know. It depends how Germany, Britain and France in that. Xi Jinping is going to Germany and France, and I guess he may come to Britain later in the year. And then the third category is the developing nations, which is BRICS, SCO, and so on, so G20. So what you've got is that in the past, the Chinese would have been circumspect about IMF and World Bank and institutions like that. China is supporting the creation of similar bodies based in the developing world, as not to replace IMF or World Bank. The Chinese will participate in the existing architecture of United Nations, IMF, World Bank, but they will also help create institutions for third world developing countries. And the Americans won't like that, but China knows it, and China is prepared to stay on course with a foreign policy which is not designed to cause a problem with the United States. It's designed to be part of a developing world approach to things, and they won't move away from it just because the Americans try to push them away from it. So it's a tense time. What do you think?
I have a feeling that it's trying to strike a balance between being firm or maybe a bit aggressive. Regarding to the business or trading, do you see any potential conflicts between the two trading blocs which are going to be formed at some point in the future?
Well, I think if they are formed into two trading blocks, then there will be conflicts between them, because the instincts of capitalism, of capitalist firms, is to protect themselves by monopolies, and so the maintenance of keeping Huawei out of the United States does have to do with security. Clearly, has to do with security, but it's clearly also a lot to do with the competitiveness of Huawei. and American companies and non-American companies trying to keep Huawei out of the important American market. If that becomes the trend through institutionalization of two blocks, then there's room for a lot of difficulties to be created. You know, we know what happened between the Soviet Union and the United States. It doesn't have to have a military aspect to it, but it's very difficult to expect that two big trading blocks will be there and they won't create Ukraines. I think what's happened in Ukraine is of great global significance, and I think it's very unfortunate that people have tried to encroach on others' areas of influence. I think it sets a bad precedent. I think China will be very worried by what's happened in the Ukraine, and I think Russia will be very worried about it. And I can't see I can see the benefits to America and to Europe of playing that game, but the downside, the risks of estrangement with Russia and China are very, very big. So it's a difficult period in world history, in my opinion. When AB suggested that there was a comparison with the outbreak of the First World War, compared China and Japan to Britain and Germany, had it completely wrong, but who's surprised? Not a very bright guy, I would guess. The proper comparison is China and America are similar to Germany and Britain. How do you manage the development of a new major force? And as I alluded to in my speech, I think the British, in the end, didn't have a conflict with the Americans. The British allowed the Americans to take over as the major power in the world and allied themselves with it. The Americans are never going to allow China to take over as the major power, but I don't think China wants to become the major power in the world. I think China wants to become the major regional power in Asia, but I think that's the end of China's ambitions. I don't think it has global ambitions. You look through in 5,000 years of history, it hasn't gone down that road. And I don't see any of you being interested in converting me to Buddhism. So I don't think China's in the business of trying to win over global supremacy. I just don't think it enters into the minds of the Chinese. Comes back a bit to your point about the characteristics of the Chinese. I think you've written us off a long time ago.
Then I just wonder, how would you see the TPP and the potential of the trading bloc that's being formed between China and the ASEAN?
How do I see the potential of? The TPP, which is being formed, and the China and the ASEAN, that trading bloc is being formed. That's what they're actually now doing. Yeah. So things you know, it broke down today, don't you? They just ended the meetings without an agreement. TPPA. Now that may not be significant. It may be that they will get together and they will Japan and America will solve their problems about the automobile industries and the rice and so on. But the problems between Japan and the United States on automobiles and rice go back 40 years. They're not new, and they have common cause. But you'll also know that as they announced the TPPA had broken up without agreement, which is of some significance but not a great deal of significance, it was also announced that the fourth round of talks between China, South Korea and Japan for a free trade area was going to happen, will go forward. So I'm quite sure that whilst there's this tension between Japan and China, there's also a desire by China to draw Japan into an Asian-based grouping rather than an international grouping. So it's still early days to decide which way. And Japan may decide its interests lie in being a little bit more independent from the United States. It's difficult to tell. I mean, I'm not an expert in the field, and the people who are experts in the field, I don't understand what they're talking about anyway. So, but I think you're absolutely right. This is where the important stuff is going on now.
Thank you. We have time for one question, maybe. Go on.
Can I have a question on football? There was a question there. Okay. You could ask a football question.
No. I kind of want to turn back to the business because I was talking about culture and other stuff. For the trading of business trading in UK and China, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of that different or difficulty to do a business with the Chinese. And based from your experience, what can Chinese improve? Because you say a lot of good stuff about Chinese. I want to hear some weakness of Chinese. What can Chinese improve to to do better business with around the world, people around the world?
You know, the major weakness China has is it doesn't have enough people with deep experience of international business. And the only way you get that is by being involved in international business. There's no shortcut. And it will take 20 to 30 years to develop the skills. And you're part of it. You're learning abroad, you work abroad, you study abroad, you get to know a great deal. And you teach your children. Excuse me, eating a mint as I'm talking. Very inappropriate. If I go back to 15 years ago, I could name the only 10 people in China who could work outside China. About 15 years ago. Today there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese. And there are more and more Chinese. You know, when the Chinese have spent a lot of time studying what the Japanese did wrong. They got the Plaza Accord wrong. They revalued their currency too easily. But what they also did was they didn't bring their law firms, their accounting firms, their banks abroad with their firms as they went global. You see Chinese accounting firms and Chinese law firms are coming into London. And so you see a great deal of well thought out development. You see a lot of testing going on, and then you see the rolling out of policies. So I don't think that I would say that there's anything I would do differently. I don't think there's anything I would do differently. I would just understand that China is in a process of developing into a global trading power. You know, you've seen ICBC just bought 60% of Standard's trading operations in London. And that's a very major move, and they'll have a lot of problems. They'll get some corruption problems, some risk problems, and that kind of stuff. But the Chinese government know unless they do this and put people in front of the fire, they won't learn the lessons that have to be learned, because you can only learn them by doing them. And as people learn and understand the problems and the risks, so they'll broaden the number of people that are exposed to that situation and broaden it. So I don't think China should rush the process of internationalization, of globalization. But I think that they've been at it now for 15, 20 years. It's only now it's being seen by the rest of the world because it's impacting businesses everywhere. You know, you go to Africa, the planes are a third full of Chinese business people. And you go back 10 years, they weren't on the planes. So the impact of China around the world is much more significant in the developing world than it is in the developed world. And does that answer your question?
Brilliant.
Yeah, I suppose I ought to have some good ideas of what I would do differently. I think that there is a great... I suppose, in closing, are we getting towards the end? I think I would say this. That the big business... If you take the big British businesses, RTZ, GSK, all these big businesses that are on the FTSE 100, they have to consider how to have business relationships with major Chinese global companies, and the Chinese have to consider how to have major business relationships with those companies. So, for example, you've seen that Tesco's had a whole lot of stores in China. China Resources formed a joint company with them. Tesco's have got 28% of that joint venture based in Hong Kong, but with stores in China. Why would China Resources just not let them close them down? Why did China Resources take a joint company giving Tesco's 28%? I think because they want Tesco's. You know, you ask yourself this question, what is the ultimate expression of going up the value chain? It's owning the retail. And I think that that's how far forward thinking China is. I think you'll begin to see China buying retailers and develop and owning retail operations in the West, if the West allows them to do it. And in Britain, they probably would be allowed to do it. In America, they might be stopped, or Germany. So I think you're going to see a great deal of what is being planned, you'll see happening in 10 or 15 years' time. I think the depth of that planning and analysis in the party is phenomenal. And you know, just in lastly, when you meet these guys, coming back to the question from that the young lady in the middle there, I've met senior officials of leading groups from the party, and they're wearing the oldest suits and they haven't got their haircut styled at all. They are very, very serious people who get on with their jobs, and they're very modest, but they're very, very skilled. In 1997, I met the leading group on the economy, and we had a discussion. It was clear to me that they were going to make major cuts in the state-owned enterprises, that they were going to put them on stock exchanges. This was in 1997. The first moves didn't happen until 2002. The first flotations, I think, were 2005. They'd already worked it out in 1997 when I met them. They probably worked it out 5 years before. So there's a lot of forward planning going on in China. It's impressive.
So it's a good idea for people here to go back to China and work for China?
You're Chinese, you know, you'll find your own missions. I think it's very interesting for you to work outside China because that's what you are. You're internationalists. That's why you're here, because you want the international exposure, you want the international contact. Some of you will feel you want to live in China and raise your children in China. For none of you right now would the issue of your children be in your minds. But I lived and worked in America. And when I decided to have children, I moved back to London because I wanted my children to speak to me in an English accent. So your international feeling may be deep now, and some of you may feel you want to be back in China when you have a family. It's part of the joys of living, you know. It's the choices are out there, but you've got them. A lot of people don't have them. Enjoy them.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Can we have a last round of applause for him?